Hello, everyone. My name is Tobi Knaup, and I'm a co-founder and co-CEO of Day2IQ. And I would like to talk to you about accelerating your business and up-leveling your organization by leveraging open source innovation. We're the leading independent Kubernetes company, and we've been contributing to open source for about 8 years since we started. We co-founded the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is the home of Kubernetes, one of the fastest growing and largest open source projects ever. We're contributing to Kubernetes. We started some of our own open source projects like Kudo, and we're active in a lot of the leadership groups, the special interest groups around Kubernetes. So open source is really central to what we do. Our enterprise products are built around a lot of open source technology that we either created ourselves or contributed to or are using from the community. And so we've learned a lot about open source in our 8 years since we started, and I'd like to share some of those learnings with you today. So when I look at how companies adopt open source, I see 4 stages of maturity or 4 stages of the journey that they go through. It starts with just using open source software, finding something that's out there in the community and leveraging that in some way to build your products. Then goes to contributing to open source projects. So companies start to give back to the community. They start to get involved in those projects. The third stage is start your own open source project. You might have an idea for how to solve a problem that hasn't been solved before in that way, and you want to start your own project. And then lastly is adopting open source culture at your company. It's actually running your company or your teams like an open source project. So I want to go through these 4 stages today and talk a little bit about what the benefits are of each. So let's start with using open source software. Why should you consider that as an enterprise? Well, what I hear a lot from folks is they say, we want to use open source software because it's free. It's cheaper to do it that way. And while that may be true in some cases, I think a lot of folks underestimate that open source software still needs to be maintained. And so, just putting together some open source pieces that you find out there and not thinking about how you do the ongoing maintenance, like how you do security updates to your stack, how do you test it, how do you upgrade it, and so forth. All of that ongoing maintenance is still something you need to think about if you adopt open source software. And so I'd say that's not really the strongest argument for using open source. While it may be a little bit cheaper in some cases, you still need to think about things like maintenance and potentially working with a vendor to do that. Another argument I hear a lot from people that are adopting open source is they want to avoid being locked in. They want to avoid being tied to one particular vendor. And that is, and how open source helps with that is that it has open APIs. Open APIs so that even if you want to discontinue working with one particular vendor, the tooling and the software you've built around the open source project is still just tied to these open APIs and not to proprietary ones that are dictated by a single vendor. So it gives you a lot more freedom in that way. The third argument I hear a lot, and this is really what I want to talk about here today, is accelerating innovation. Open source projects tend to move much faster than closed source projects, and that is simply because there's usually a large community behind them. A lot of folks that are very passionate about moving the project forward, building new features, improving quality, fixing bugs, all of those things. The open source community is a very eager group of folks. And when they use a piece of software and they find something wrong with it, a lot of folks will put in the work to fix those problems. And so overall, if as an enterprise you adopt open source software in your stack, you get a piece of technology that is innovating and moving along incredibly fast. The other aspect of this is by using open source, you free up your team from solving problems that have been solved before. anything that's already known that has been solved, you just take that piece of software and use it. And so that frees up your team to solve the problems that haven't been solved before, that create unique differentiation for your company. So that's how open source software accelerates innovation. Open source software can also help you accelerate hiring and attracting top talent. A lot of software engineers in particular, they like to contribute to open source projects or work with open source projects to build their resumes. It's very attractive to be part of these communities. And so if you're looking to hire top talent for your team, that is a great way to do it as well. And so I always encourage folks to absolutely advertise that on their jobs website or in their job descriptions that you're working a lot with open source software. And then another aspect of using open source is you can customize it. So if you have unique requirements, maybe you're using the open source project slightly different than its creators intended or than the community around it intends, you can use all that code and modify it to your needs. And so that's another way how you can accelerate innovation. Instead of having to start completely from scratch to solve a unique problem that you have, you can take what's there, you can use that foundation and then customize it, much like you can play with Legos and customize that to your needs. All right, so that was about using open source software, just taking what's there and implementing it in your internal stack. So now let's move to the next stage. Why should you consider as an organization to contribute back to open source software? There's really a couple reasons to do that. The first one, and a really big one, is it really helps you upskill your organization. Open source communities, in particular the larger ones, and the ones that are managed well, that are part of some foundation like the Linux Foundation or the Apache Foundation, which really give projects guidance on how to manage a project properly, how to govern it. Those projects tend to be really well run. And so by letting your engineers participate in those open source communities and contribute back, they learn from other incredible engineers that are part of those projects, and they get better through that. So it's a great way to really train your folks. And it's a very natural way to do it too. They just absorb that knowledge. They automatically get better by just interacting and working with those communities. And another great aspect of this is not just does it help you upskill individuals, but it's a great way to also find inspiration for how to run things internally. Those projects tend to have really great best practices around, for example, code reviews or the release process or decision-making, governance, that make a ton of sense in a lot of cases to also adopt internally as an organization. So not just a great way to train individuals, but also to upskill your organization as a whole and adopt those best practices for how you want to run internally. Another aspect of contributing to open source is it gives you an opportunity to influence the direction of a project. So on that point that I just raised previously, if you have a need to customize an open source project for your unique needs, well, maybe you want to give that back to the community. Maybe there are others out there that could benefit from that. And maybe if you influence the direction of a project, it'll fit your needs even better. And so by becoming a major contributor in a project, it gives you that strong voice, that leadership, and being able to influence that project. And a second aspect of this too is it's a great way to build your brand, to put your brand out there into the community and be recognized as a technology leader. Taking a leadership position in an open source project is a great way to do that. Now, we've talked about using open source software and then contributing back to an open source project. The next stage would be starting your own project. And a key reason to do that, again, is it accelerates innovation. A lot of times, when you look at the companies that release, some of the well-known large open source projects that we know about, like Apache Kafka, for example, which was created by LinkedIn originally, or Apache Cassandra, which was created at Facebook originally. One of the key reasons that they open source these projects is it helps accelerate those projects. By putting it out there and finding a large amount of users for the project, and then eventually creating a community of contributors, it really moves that project forward fast. Because open source users are they're the ultimate focus group, essentially. They use your product, they give you feedback. You can put your engineering designs out there and get feedback on those. People love contributing to those. Those users will use that product and they will break it, and they'll tell you what happened. They'll help you debug those issues. They'll even get engaged and help you fix those bugs. They'll find new use cases for your software and contribute those use cases to it. And so back to a point that I raised earlier, open source projects tend to move much faster than closed source projects. And that is simply because you have these vibrant communities that contribute, and they invest their time and push the project forward that way. Open source projects are also a great way to evangelize. Open source really is built around evangelism. Open source community members go to conferences and talk about the new projects that they hear about. They exchange best practices there. They are very vocal online about what they're using and how they're using it and the new exciting projects they're finding. And so it's a great way to build awareness and adoption as well. Not just for the open source project itself, but it also helps your company. Let's say you're putting a new product to market and you want to kickstart a user community around it. A great way to do that is to release an open source version of that product and build that community around it to spread the word, to raise awareness, to get adoption. And then that gives you the opportunity to also you'll sell your enterprise version or your paid for version of that product around it. So great way to evangelize. Another great aspect of this is once an open source project takes off and it gets larger and it finds more users and use cases, very quickly an ecosystem forms around that project. What you see here is what's called the cloud native landscape. So it's a map of all the open source projects that are part of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and its larger ecosystem. There's hundreds of projects on here that were created, for certain additional use cases or to fill gaps in the core products. And by creating this rich ecosystem, you increase the value that your product delivers. So your users, your customers will ultimately find your product, your open source project more valuable, even though it's only a part of this ecosystem, because the ecosystem enables so many more use cases for it. So it's a really great way to increase the value. Now to the final stage here, stage 4, and that is adopting open source culture. So now you've used open source software, you've contributed to projects, you've started your own open source project. The final stage, and very few organizations do that, is you can actually run all of your internal projects and internal teams like open source projects as well. Even though they're not truly open source, you can adopt those same best practices and those same methodologies internally. It really helps you move faster. It really helps accelerate innovation. And so the recommendation there is to create an open source program office. There's some great resources for how to do that I'll talk about in a second. And essentially, you just mirror what the open source community does. So when you manage your internal software projects, you have similar workflows, you have similar decision making, you have similar tools to do that. In an organization that does a lot with open source software, that just feels natural anyways. And the final bit here, and this is what very few companies actually do, even large open source companies, that is, if you truly treat internal projects as open, it really helps you accelerate innovation. So you're literally saying, okay, even though this project is owned by team A, if someone on team B wants to use this project for a different use case, they can just take it, make their own code contributions, and then the team that created it, team A, will review those and give feedback, much like a open source contribution happens out in the community. So it really simplifies communication internally. You don't have to, if you want to use an internal project for something new, you don't have to wait to get until that team's schedule. You can just start working on it and contribute that code back. So it's a really great way to have autonomous teams and allow them to move independently and move fast. So now if you're wondering, how do I do all that? What are the best practices here? The Linux Foundation, one of the largest open source software foundations out there, has some really great resources. So if you just go to linuxfoundation.org and click on resources, lots of great content here around how do I create an open source program? How do I manage the success of that program? How do I participate in open source communities and so forth? A lot of great content on there. I highly recommend it. All right, so we talked a lot about open source software and what open source software can do to accelerate your organization and to upskill your team. But I want to ask the question, what's next for open source? And we talk about open source in the context of software predominantly, but where else is open source happening? Where else could it really make a difference, accelerate innovation? And we see open source actually spinning up in a lot of different places. Machine learning, which is still pretty close to software. Machine learning is getting a lot of traction. And there are now online hubs like the TensorFlow Hub, where you can find pre-trained machine learning models that other folks have put hours and hours and thousands of dollars of compute time into to train them to make them work. And so, for example, if you have an image classification problem, you want to detect objects and images, you can now just go here and use these pre-trained models to do that. And then going back to the Lego point, right, using something that's out there and adapting it to your own needs, with techniques like transfer learning in machine learning, you can even do that now. You can use a pre-trained object detection model, say, for images, and then using transfer learning, you can adopt it to your own problem domain where you might have objects that this upstream model is not able to detect yet. So it's a really great way to also accelerate machine learning projects. We're seeing open source really play a big role here too. And it makes sense because machine learning is still in the software domain, but we're also seeing it in the hardware domain. So with 3D printing in particular, folks have started sharing a lot of designs for open source hardware, like this Revit, but also much more complicated things. And so it's a really great way to accelerate innovation in hardware as well. We're in a pandemic right now, and a lot of times a crisis is also a breeding ground for new ideas and for accelerating innovation. And so NASA and some partners created this open source mechanical ventilator. Design is freely available out there. Anyone can take those blueprints, those designs, and build a ventilator. Also relevant to this year and the pandemic, there are now multiple initiatives actually around open source pharma, right? So similar to how we talked about software being developed much faster if it's done in the open with the larger community, new medicines are usually also developed in closed settings, like within a single company. And the same thinking applies here. If that would be done in the open source, we might get to breakthroughs in medicine much, much faster. And so those are really exciting developments. I think this particular organization is called opensourcepharma.net. So we're seeing open source really transform not just software, but multiple industries. It's still in its infancy here, but I fully expect that to continue and that we'll see open source happen in a lot more industries in the future. And that is it for my talk today. Thank you very much for listening. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A that is scheduled in a few hours from now. So please join me then, and look forward to talk to you. Thank you.